I am an environmentalist, environmental activist, environmental professor. Since 1985, I've spent 30 years fighting incineration and promoting more sustainable ways of handling waste. And that has taken me to 49 states in the United States, 7 provinces in Canada, and 62 other countries. And I'm only here today because I gave a presentation last night on a proposed incinerator in Cowley. And this interest in waste led to the publication of this book in 2013. The subtitle is Zero Waste Solution, Untrashing the Planet One Community at a Time. The foreword to this book was written by Jeremy Irons, who hosted this movie, Trashed, which I appear in several times. Now, I've spent the last 20 years fighting water fluoridation, first as a professor of chemistry, specializing in environmental chemistry and toxicology, and now as director of the Fluoride Action Network. And that work culminated in the publication of another book, The Case Against Fluoride, which I co-authored with 2 other scientists, Professor James Beck, a retired professor of physics from Calgary, has an MD as well as a PhD, and Speddy Micklem, who has the equivalent of a PhD from Oxford, retired professor of biology. So retired professor of chemistry, retired professor of physics, retired professor of biology. And we went through all the science underpinning the case against fluoride. And every single fact in there is documented with the scientific literature, over 80 pages of references. And yet, after 5 years, we've had no response, no scientific response to this from the promoters of fluoridation. If they had produced a book like this, called The Case for Fluoridation, within a few weeks, we would have had a rebuttal, chapter by chapter, sentence by sentence, reference by reference. But they have the power, so they don't have to deal much with the science. Now, I've avidly promoted recycling for 30 years, but water fluoridation is the worst recycling practice in the world. It's quite bizarre, it's quite extraordinary, and you need to know a little bit of history here, environmental history. For about 100 years, the phosphate fertilizer industry contaminated the local environment. And you have to understand the process by which phosphate, they take phosphate rock and they convert it into soluble phosphate, which they then can use for fertilizer. And the solubilization occurs when they add sulfuric acid. But when you add sulfuric acid to this rock, it converts the fluoride, which is also in the rock, to hydrogen fluoride, which also attacks the sand and it produces silicon tetrafluoride. So this process liberates 2 very toxic gases, hydrogen fluoride and silicon tetrafluoride. And for 100 years, these 2 gases contaminated the vegetation, crippled the cattle that ate that vegetation, and also damaged the citrus groves in Polk County, Florida, where most of this stuff is done. Another thing that you should know is that the same phosphate rock, which is mined for fertilizer, is also mined for uranium. So in this process, and for 100 years, as I said, the pollution was allowed to contaminate the environment. And then they would put wet scrubbers on, a spray of water, which converts the hydrogen fluoride and the silicon tetrafluoride to a substance called hexafluorosilicic acid, which is contaminated. It's contaminated with arsenic, lead, and other toxic metals, and some small amounts of radioactive isotopes. Now, they can't dump that stuff into the sea by international law. They can't dump it locally because it's far too concentrated. But one of the vagaries of hazardous waste regulations in the United States, and this is a hazardous waste, is that if another company or if somebody buys the hazardous waste from you, then it becomes a product. And it's no longer regulated by hazardous waste regulations, cradle to grave, etc. Now, that was a good law from a recycling point of view. It was a good law. for the chemical industry, because we want the chemical industry as much as possible using their toxic byproducts back into new processes. But unfortunately, the bizarre thing is that the people that are purchasing this hazardous waste are the local water authorities. And they can do it because it's a product, and then they're allowed to put it in our drinking water. So we can't dump it into the sea, which gives us virtually infinite dilution. But we're allowed to dump it into the public water supply with a dilution of about 200,000 to 1, to get it down to 1 part per million. So, as I said, a very, very bizarre recycling practice. Now, one of the things that you undoubtedly have been exposed to as representatives, public representatives, is the endorsements. Proponents use a long list of endorsements from government bodies and professional bodies that fluoridation is safe, effective, safe, effective, safe, effective. They keep repeating this ad nauseum. But these endorsements, if you look at the history of it, it's covered in my book, these endorsements go back to the 1950s. They go back to 1950 when the US Public Health Service endorsed fluoridation. And once that domino fell, the other dominoes fell just rapidly. Within 2 years, the American Dental Association, American Medical Association, all the dental associations, etc., the Public Health Association, all endorsed fluoridation. Now, the interesting thing is that in 1950, they had no science on the table. None of the trials, which began in 1945, had been completed. They had virtually no science on the safety of swallowing fluoride. And yet, they got all these endorsements. And all these endorsements then represent today is how difficult it is for bureaucracies to change their minds once they've adopted something as a policy. Once it's a policy. When policy is king, science becomes a slave. And that's what you're seeing. Any science that does not fit in with their mantra of safe and effective is junk science. Any scientist like me that opposes fluoridation is clearly a little strange, a little wonky, a little flat earth, or whatever they come up with. But for me, as a professor of chemistry, science is king. And our public health policy should accept only the best science. And the science which says that fluoridation is effective is wonky science. It's very weak. And that was just demonstrated a few weeks ago with the Cochrane Review. The Cochrane Review is based in England. They use a system for reviewing a meta-analysis of all the studies. They're very meticulous about what studies they accept. And at the end of the day, they concluded that the evidence that fluoridation actually reduces tooth decay is very, very weak indeed. Weak study. But more important, the studies which indicate that it is not safe are more important. Now, it's also worth pointing out that even though the endorsements have been very effective in North America and a few other countries like Australia and New Zealand to keep this practice going, it hasn't influenced most of the world. Most of the world does not drink fluoridated water. Half the people drinking fluoridated water live in the United States. About 400 million people worldwide drink fluoridated water. Over 200 million live in the United States. Most of the rest of the world does not fluoridate its water, including 97% of Europe. So they weren't influenced by those endorsements in the same way that our health officials are influenced. And so what's happened here is that fluoridation has become a belief system which is resistant to new scientific evidence. And again, I would caution you to be very wary of reviews commissioned by pro-fluoridation governments, because they usually end up hand-picking panels who are known to be pro-fluoridation to deliver a rubber stamp to the government to keep this policy going. And I give you I'll give you 3 examples. The 2002 Irish Fluoridation Forum, which I know a lot about. I was flown over to testify before that forum. It was a complete rubber stamp and produced one of the worst reviews of the literature on fluoridation that has ever emerged. The 2007 Australian National Health and Medical Research Council is another rubber stamp. The NHMRC is actually part of the Australian government, which strongly endorses fluoridation. And lastly, you have your own Canadian review, Health Canada review. And the shocking fact here is that they used a panel of 6 experts to review the literature on both safety and effectiveness. And four of those 6 panelists were dentists reviewing the health literature. And those 4 dentists were known to be pro-fluoridation, avidly pro-fluoridation. And well, there's a little interesting point here, is that one of those dentists was a guy called Jay Kumar, who promotes fluoridation avidly. He works for the New York State Department of Health. And he was on the panel, the National Research Council panel, that reported in 2006. And this was the first balanced panel that has ever reviewed this literature. 500 pages, 1,100 references, 12-member panel, and they had 3 pro-fluoridation, 3 anti-fluoridation, and 6 who have not declared a position. Well, here is this Health Canada choosing Jay Kumar from New York State, choosing this Jay Kumar because he was pro-fluoridation, and avoided Hardy Lineback, who was at the University of Toronto, who was also on that National Research Council. A PhD in biochemistry and a member of this National Research Council panel. So if they wanted to show the public that they were really going to look at this objectively, why didn't they have Jay Kumar and Hardy Lineback? One dentist pro-fluoridation, one dentist anti-fluoridation, both serving on the National Research Council, who studied the literature for 3 years. But no, they didn't, because that panel was designed to deliver a rubber stamp for fluoridation. And councils all over Canada fall for this. You fall for it. It's pretty sad. Now, I'm going to talk about the facts about fluorine, fluoride, and nature's protection of the baby. This is where we get into environment, because evolution is very much part of our environment. I will then go on to talk about the fact that our children are being overexposed to fluoride, that fluoride is neurotoxic. The last children that need their IQ lowered are children from low-income families. And the evidence of swallowing fluoride lowers tooth decay, I've already talked about this, extremely weak. And finally, there are better ways of fighting tooth decay in low-income families. So you're not trapped by this. If you stop fluoridation, which you should do, if you stop fluoridation, it doesn't mean that you're depriving anybody of fluoride. They can go to any pharmacy, any supermarket and buy fluoridated toothpaste, brush it on their teeth, and spit it out. This way they avoid exposing all the tissues in the body to a known toxic substance. And you don't force it on people that don't want it. So you solve the medical problem and the ethical problem. You do not deprive people of fluoride just because you end the foolish and obsolete practice of putting this substance in the water. So let's look at the issues then that impinge upon the environment. Facts about fluorine and fluoride. Fluorine is the 13th most abundant element in the Earth's crust. But it does not occur as the free element because it's extremely reactive. So fluorine reacts with anything that it comes into contact with, including all the other elements. It only occurs then as compounds, which we call fluorides. The element is fluorine, but the compounds, when it combines with other elements, are called fluorides. And all the metallic fluorides, that's when it's combined with a metal like sodium, calcium, aluminum, and so on, they're all ionic. And that means if they dissolve in water, the ions go their separate ways. So when you dissolve calcium fluoride in water, the calcium goes one way, the fluoride goes the other way. As far as we are concerned, there are two separate chemicals. There is the chemical called calcium ions, free in water, and there's fluoride ions, free in water. There's no way that we can just add fluoride ions to the water. We have to add it with the other component. But still, from all the toxicological and environmental implications, it's the free fluoride ion that we're concerned about. Now, environment. The level of fluoride that naturally occurs in some water supplies, notice that word naturally, is a function of geology, not nature. Right? It's the vagaries of which rocks that water flows through. And the rocks came before biology. The rocks were there before evolution. So in the history of our planet, you lay down the mountains and so on. And then later on, life evolved from the sea. So what about the level of fluoride in the sea? The average level of the fluoride ion in the oceans is 1.4 parts per million. Now, this is very, very important because, as I said, life evolved from the sea. And so there wasn't an absence of fluoride for evolution. Plenty there. And yet nature has found very little use for the fluoride ion in biology. And no use for the fluoride ion in our bodies. In fact, in mammals, there's not one single molecule, protein, fat, nucleic acid, carbohydrate, or any metabolite which contains fluoride. Nature didn't use it. It was there, but she didn't use it. Next, not one single biochemical process in the body has been shown to need fluoride to function properly. In other words, fluoride is not an essential nutrient. We do not need it. We can have perfect health without fluoride. We can have perfect teeth without fluoride. We don't need fluoride. So why are we swallowing it with every glass of water that you drink in Lethbridge? That's sort of common sense stuff. But it gets worse. Because whilst we can't find any place where nature has used fluoride, we can find many places where fluoride harms biology, harms our biochemical processes. It's very toxic. Fluoride is highly toxic. And so when you talk about the environment, again, we can't dump it into the sea by international law, but by putting it in the public water supply, you're flushing it through our bodies, and then where does it go? Into the environment, into our little streams, our ponds, our lakes, and has the potential to impact the aquatic food chains. Now, as far as the toxic effects that fluoride has in biology, and in biochemistry, if you find toxic effects in one species, you usually find it in another one. So this also not just deals with human biology, but also with all the biology out there. And there's this very important review by Barbier, published in 2010, which goes into all the mechanisms of fluoride's toxicity, which is vast. I mean, there's a vast amount of literature on this. And anybody that knows anything about biochemistry, would not sanction for one moment swallowing fluoride. It's absurd. And let me explain why. Fluoride is a fairly benign chemical species, and that's why I kept away from the issue for a long time. I thought that the anti-fluoridation people were confusing fluorine with fluoride. That's like confusing chlorine, which kills people, with sodium chloride, which you sprinkle on your potatoes. We know that when elements combine, their properties change. And so this very, very reactive element, fluorine, becomes a fairly benign substance when it's combined with metals and other elements. However, what I learned in 1996, which shook me, is that whilst It's a benign chemical species. It's very active biologically. It's very actively biologically. In fact, for these reasons. It forms complexes with most metal ions. It's attracted to positive centers. It clusters around metal ions. And many of those metal ions are very important to us, like calcium and magnesium. And also, by clustering around these metal ions, it can sometimes transport toxic metal ions where it normally wouldn't go, like aluminium. And as far as animals are concerned, rats fed fluoride at 1 part per million, that's the same level we use in our drinking water, developed for 1 year, rats fed drinking water containing fluoride at 1 part per million, either as aluminium fluoride or as sodium fluoride, developed kidney damage, brain damage, which is visible under a microscope, and a greater uptake of aluminium into the brain and beta amyloid deposits, which are characteristic of Alzheimer's disease. So, as well as forming these complexes with metal ions, which means it can really interfere with fundamental processes, which I'll talk more about in a moment, it also forms a strong hydrogen bond. So all our creatures, when that water goes into the environment, all our wild creatures are going to be exposed to these things, which are going to be interfering with their biochemistry just as it interferes with our biochemistry. Now, the end result of those two things, forming a strong hydrogen bond and forming complexes with metal ions, is it inhibits many enzymes. And enzymes, we've got thousands of them in our body. They're proteins, and they steer. Every single chemical reaction in our body is steered by an enzyme. And it's because these enzymes are proteins, it's because they can fold into beautiful structures that they are able to catalyze all the reactions in our bodies. But fluoride can interfere with those. And fluoride enables the uptake of some toxic metals into places where they otherwise wouldn't go. I just gave you the example of the Varna study where it increased the uptake of aluminum into the brain in rats. It interferes with calcium and magnesium in various critical ways. Most of us, when we hear calcium, think of the bones, we think of the teeth. But calcium is a very important messenger in neurological systems. It's involved in neurotransmission. It's involved in the signals between the nerves and the muscles. And magnesium is also critical in many ways. And it interferes, fluoride also interferes with G proteins. And if you come to the meeting tonight, I shall go into how fluoride actually messes around with these proteins which deliver messages across membranes. Again, all these things would be happening in the environment with those creatures, with those fish, and so on, as well as human beings. Now, in my view, it's no accident that the level of fluoride in mother's milk is extremely low. Now remember this, when they say fluoride is natural, we're just using it, it's naturally in the water. That judgment is geological, right? It's a vagary of geology. Nothing to do with nature's judgment. This is nature's judgment about how much fluoride a mammal should get when they're born. And it's extremely low. So in my view, mother's milk protects our babies. Whether by accident or whether by design, I tend to think it's design, because there's no use for it, and we know it has many harmful effects. So the level in mother's milk is 0.004 parts per million, which means that a bottle-fed baby in Lethbridge, that protection is removed. So that baby in Lethbridge is getting about 200 times more fluoride than nature intended, than evolution, than the environmental processes intended. And that, to me, is a reckless thing to do, and I think the chickens are coming home to rest. The first thing we know is that the dental fluorosis rates have skyrocketed. When they started fluoridation, they thought that only 10% of the kids would have this mottling, this discoloration of the enamel. In Canada, you've got lousy data. They did a survey of dental fluorosis in Canada, but they didn't distinguish between the kids that were in fluoridated communities and non-fluoridated communities. The obvious thing to do, but they didn't do it. So today in the United States, and I suspect the levels in Canada are the same or similar, 41% of all American children between the ages of 12 and 15 have this condition called dental fluorosis, which means that they have been overexposed to fluoride. And there it is, 28.5% have very mild, 8.6% have mild, 3.6% have moderate or severe. This is what they look like. Mild is 50% of the enamel impacted. That's affecting 8.6% of American teenagers. And 3.6% have moderate or severe, which impacts 100% of the surface. Now we could go into, but this is not the place to do it, what the psychological impacts are to kids, teenagers, who don't want to smile on their first date because of this condition. But I'm not going to go there, because I think the more fundamental question that should have been addressed 70 years ago, and should have been studied 70 years ago, and has not been studied very adequately since, should have been, when fluoride is damaging the enamel in mammals, in humans, what is it doing to the other developing tissues? It's damaging the growing tooth cells by some biochemical mechanism, some internal mechanism. It's interfering with the laying down of the enamel. There's probably inhibiting enzymes in the growing tooth cells. What makes us think that when fluoride is doing that to the growing tooth cells, it's not damaging other developing tissues? I believe the judgment that it wouldn't, which was made in 1950 by the US Public Health Service without the science, was a reckless decision. And it's been reckless to continue this practice with very, very little study of the other tissues. All the studies, nearly all the studies are done on teeth in Canada. Teeth, 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 as if the only tissue in the body was teeth. That there are no other tissues that fluoride might attack, even though it attacks at the fundamental biochemical level, hydrogen bonds, complexing, and so on. Not only in humans, but in mammals and in fish in the environment. And we're pouring millions of tons of this stuff into the environment from the phosphate fertilizers. So, yes, now the evidence is in. Fluoride is neurotoxic. I've got a listing of all the studies. You can find them on our website, floridaction.net. They're all there. They're all listed. A study that many people heard about was in 2012. Choi, a team from Harvard and China, published a meta-analysis of 27 studies. And in these studies, they compared the IQ of children in high fluoride villages with low fluoride villages. And of the 27 studies, about 5 or 6 were the high fluoride was coming from coal burning, coal used to heat or cook housing. But the rest were fluoride, the exposure was from water. And here's the analysis. It was published in Environmental Health Perspectives, as one of the leading environmental health journals in the world. And this team acknowledged that many of these studies, not all, had weaknesses. They wanted more information. You always want more information in human epidemiological studies. But they stressed that results were remarkably consistent. Out of 27 studies, 26 out of 27, the average IQ in the high fluoride village was lower than the average IQ in the low fluoride village by about 7 IQ points, which is highly significant. If you lowered the IQ of the whole population by 7 IQ points, you'd halve the number of geniuses in your society and double the number of mentally handicapped. That's serious. Now, the fluoridation proponents have argued that the concentrations in the high fluoride villages were not relevant to water fluoridation in the United States and Canada. They are wrong. Here's a table of 20 of the studies which gives the fluoride concentration in the high fluoride village. And if you look at the average of all those studies, the average level in the high fluoride villages is 3.52 parts per million. And that 3.5 parts per million is lower than the US EPA's safe drinking water standard. So how can you say it's not relevant to the United States when they're finding lowering IQ at levels below our safe drinking water standard? And in several studies, the fluoride village was less than 3 parts per million. Here I pulled out 5 studies. Look at the levels in the high fluoride village: 1.8, 2, 2.9, 2.5, 2.38. And I can tell you right away that none of those studies leave you with an adequate margin of safety to protect all children drinking fluoridated water at 1 part per million or 0.7 parts per million. There's just not an adequate margin of safety there. We normally use a safety factor of 10 when we are extrapolating from known found harm to a safe level for everybody. But the proponents don't talk about margin of safety. They simply do a crude comparison of the concentration in the village where you found harm and the concentration that we put in the drinking water, and said, oh look, it's 3 times higher, we don't need to worry. They have no idea of toxicology, no idea. It doesn't matter because it's policy, not science that they're interested in. But the Harvard review is just the tip of the iceberg as far as fluoride's neurotoxicity is concerned. There are over 100 animal studies that indicate that fluoride can enter the brain and change brain chemistry, and some at very low levels. I mentioned one of them, Varna, that was done at 1 part per million. And whilst, again, going back to the environment, Kathy Justice and her husband, Wayne, have a horse farm, or whatever you call it, they breed quarter horses. They're very, very proud of these horses. They've won many prizes. And then one day in Pagosa Springs, they fluoridated the water. It killed some of their horses, made the others very, very sick. They had a leading veterinarian from Cornell University diagnose that those animals had dental fluorosis and skeletal fluorosis. So there's no question that fluoride was the cause. Now, why aren't horse farms all over the world reporting the same problem if the horses drink fluoridated water and have these awful conditions that they had in Pagosa Springs? And the answer possibly is the high elevation. Pagosa Springs is several thousand feet above sea level. And it turns out that as you go to higher elevations, fluoride becomes more toxic. So those horses may be guinea pigs for us. But again, it brings us back to the environment. Not just in wild animals, but in domestic animals, because cows and horses and others, they drink copious quantities of water. And again, talking about other species, dogs. Large dogs are renowned for losing the use of their back legs. How much of that is due to the accumulation of fluoride in their bones? And also, dogs seem to be the most sensitive species to osteosarcoma, which is a rare bone cancer. And is this also caused by the fluoride? The fluoride in their chow, the fluoride in their water. Again, they've started studies on that, but they haven't got very, very far. Horses, dogs, cows. Back to rats. Rats and mice put into mazes. You know, these are standard techniques in animal psychology. They find that the animals dosed with fluoride are less able to memorize and learn. You know, they set it up so that the mouse knows that it goes a certain way. It gets a lump of cheese, but it's got to remember which way that is. And when they're dosed with fluoride, they're less able. And there have been other human studies, which are not IQ studies. One of them in particular, you take that Ray Oster's complex figure test. What they do in this test for very young children, they're too young to take IQ studies. They show them this complex picture with lots of elements in it, and they say, copy this. The kid copies it. And then they take the picture away and say, draw it again. And the kids try to recall it from memory. And they found that when they've administered this test, and very well controlled, by the way, this is a Mexican study, very well controlled, they found that children performed less well for their age range when they'd been exposed to fluoride than their counterparts. But now to the IQ studies. There have now been 44 out of 51 studies which have found an association between fairly modest exposure to fluoride and lowered IQ. And I want to give you the details of one study because I went to China and I went at the invitation of this author Zhang and visited these two villages. One village had an average fluoride in their well water of 0.36 parts per million. And the other village, the high fluoride village, had an average of 2.5 parts per million in their well water. It's all well water. They controlled for lead exposure and iodine intake and retrospectively for arsenic. So when the proponents complain about poor studies, this is a very well done study because they controlled for a lot of the variables which interfere with mental development. They found a drop of 5 to 10 IQ points across the whole age range, and you see the whole IQ curve is shifted over. So if you look on the right-hand side, the magenta curve is the high fluoride village. You see less intelligent children, less very intelligent children, and on the right-hand side, on the left-hand side, more mentally handicapped children. Now they did something else, which nobody else has done, is that they took the children in the high fluoride village and they subdivided them up into different concentrations. This is within the high fluoride village, which incidentally knocks out any argument about differences between the two villages, because this is one village, the high fluoride village. If you look at groups A, B, C, D, and E, there's the fluoride concentrations for those children. 0.75, 1.53, 2.46, 3.28, 4.16 parts per million. Now look over here and see the IQ. And you can see the IQ is dropping. It doesn't drop much from controls for the 0.75, but when you get to 1.5, you see it's dropped by 5 IQ points, and then 1.5 to 2.46, another 3 IQ points, and then 2.5 to 3.3, another 3 or 4 IQ points, and then another drop when you go to the 4 point limit. So there it is if you can plot it linearly. So it looks as if as the water concentration goes up, the IQ goes down. That's the kind of dose response that you're looking for in any epidemiological study. It strengthens your study. You know, you're not just comparing a high concentration with low concentration. You see the change parallels the change in concentration. So this data would suggest that IQ is lowered somewhere between 0.75 and 1.5 parts per million. Going back to those horses for a moment, Kathy was meticulous about documenting the symptoms of these horses exposed to fluoride. And one of the symptoms was a change in behavior. Animals which were normally very affectionate, calm, became very irritable and nasty. Nasty. She got bitten by them. Again, suggesting that we're not just talking about lowering IQ in humans, but we may be impacting the mental abilities of our animals out there. Now, I should also add, in two respects, these Chinese children were getting less exposure to fluoride than many children in North American areas, because they were not breastfed. They weren't bottle fed. So that's a big difference in exposure for a baby. The babies there in these rural Chinese areas were largely breastfed, not bottle fed. You don't get much bottle feeding in rural Chinese areas. And then also, they weren't using fluoridated toothpaste. So when we combine these two things, a lowering of IQ between 0.75 and 1.5, which gives us no adequate margin of safety to protect all our kids. And you also combine that with the fact that in some respects those kids were getting less fluoride than the Canadian and American children. we've got a serious problem here. And you've been very, very patient. So I'm going to just end with one statement here. The last children who need their IQ lowered in America, in Canada, in England, in Australia, in New Zealand, are children from low-income families. Because those kids have already got so many strikes against them, as far as IQ is concerned, with home conditions, the toxicity and pollution in inner cities, lack of opportunities, poor schooling, and so on. So many strikes against them. These are the last children that need a few more IQ points off their IQ. And yet these are the very children who are the rationale for fluoridation. We must fluoridate in order to get fluoride to low-income children, because they're not getting the dental services that middle-income take. This goes to families. They don't have to think about it. The kids can get the fluoride to prevent their tooth decay. First, the evidence is not there, according to the Cochrane review, that you can see a difference in tooth decay based upon fluoridation that is helping socially, economically deprived children. First of all, it's wonky. But, more importantly, the very children that we have selected as our target are the very children that least need to be impacted this way. So I think that fluoridation is a classic case of good intentions which have gone awry. And now the question is, do decision makers have the guts to recognize this science and break away from the indoctrination? In my presentation, you can find it afterwards. I have a question there, which I would particularly like your medical officer of health. Your medical officer of health, I would like you to ask him this question. Mr. So-and-so, Dr. So-and-so, what gives you the confidence that allows you to ignore all this evidence that fluoride is neurotoxic? Where are the studies? Don't tell me about a review by Health Canada, which is a dummy review. Give me the science which has persuaded you, doctor, that you don't have to worry about the possibility that something that we're putting in the drinking water of every child in this country, or virtually, is not lowering their IQ. Where's the science? Where's the confidence? What is your confidence based upon? Is it based upon science, or is it based upon the fact that when you work for Health Canada, policy is king? That you don't question policy, your job is to promote policy. And if you don't promote policy, you've lost your job, medical officer of health, haven't you? So I think it's time to end this pantomime. The panel, decision makers like yourself and your colleagues, if the pressure builds up from these folks who don't want this stuff in their drinking water every day, if the pressure builds up, you'll have a little public hearing, and in the middle of that public hearing, you'll call upon the medical officer of health. And the medical officer of health will come up and he will swear up and down that there's no evidence, there's no scientific evidence that fluoride causes harm or anything. Please be ready for that moment and ask him that question. Where is the evidence, the scientific evidence, the primary studies that you can put in this scale pan and balance out the over 100 animal studies which shows that fluoride damages the brain, the 30 learning experiments which fluoride interferes with, the 44 IQ studies? Where are your studies to balance that out? And if you can't produce them, I think it's a clear case for the precautionary principle to kick in. And if you protect us, you will also be protecting the environment. Thank you.
For me, as an environmental, sitting on the Environment Committee, this really is about, are we providing safe, potable drinking water to the citizens of Lethbridge? That is my primary responsibility. I'm not a scientist. I'm not going to debate the scientists. I have no knowledge, nor do I have the ability, or quite frankly, the authority, nor should I, to debate the science. So for me, is are we providing clean, potable drinking water to the citizens? What's interesting about that is it's monitored by the Alberta Environment, not Alberta Health. So In your opinion, do you support the idea that a municipal government should be making healthcare decisions by putting stuff in their water when that's really not their mandate?
Absolutely not. There is no justification whatsoever for doing this. In fact, the proof is in the pudding. Since water fluoridation began in 1945, we have not used the public water supply to deliver any other human treatment, any other medical treatment. In other words, we haven't, all the other chemicals that we put in the water are to treat the water, make it safe to drink. But this is the exception where you put something in the water and use the convenience of a water supply to deliver a drug, deliver this medical treatment. And it's obvious why we haven't done it with any other substance. Because once you put the medicine in the water, you can't control the dose, which is critical in this case because there's such a small margin of safety for a number of health effects. I mean, there's no argument that fluoride is toxic. There's no argument that fluoride has damaged the health of millions of people. The argument about is there an adequate margin of safety between the levels which cause harm and the levels which people are going to get, sufficient to protect everyone? And I say, no, there isn't. But anyway, you can't control the dose. You can't control who it goes to. It goes to everybody. The highest dose of fluoride goes to the bottle-fed infant. The bottle-fed infant. Not doing them any good, because the teeth haven't even erupted, and possibly doing them harm. Thirdly, it violates the individual's right to informed consent. It should never have got out of the starting blocks here. You go to any website of the American Medical Association, the Canadian Medical Association, the British Medical Association, somewhere you'll find informed consent to medication. The doctor is required to tell the patient what the side effects are, what the benefits are, and the patient then, in theory, is meant to make the decision of whether they're going to have that treatment or not. Now, most patients don't bother. If the doctor tells them to do it, they do it. They don't question it. But the fact remains is if your doctor said, drink this because it's going to do you some good, and you say, I don't want to drink it. He says, I think you should drink it. And if you don't drink it, don't come back to my office. If it puts any pressure on you to take this medication when you've decided that you don't want to take it, he could lose or she could lose her license. So just another bizarre aspect of this is Lethbridge is doing to everyone in Lethbridge what an individual doctor can do to no one in Lethbridge. Force them to take medication without their informed consent.
So I think that goes back to my comment about it's not my responsibility to act as anyone's doctor, but to provide clean and safe water. What I'm hearing you say is this compound, hydrofluorosilicic acid, is not required to clean water.
No, absolutely not. It's not there to treat the water, make it safe or anything, no.
You also mentioned that there hasn't been any, since 1945, there hasn't been any addition to fluoride water in Canada. I don't think that's quite right.
Any what?
Addition. So when was the last time, do you know, where they actually started adding water to community, fluoride to community water supply?
It started in 1945. Brantford, Ontario was one of the first communities fluoridated.
Do you know what the last community was to include this?
All I know is a number of communities are taking it out. In British Columbia, there's only about 1.6% of the communities are fluoridated. In Quebec, it's about 2% of the communities are fluoridated. Most of the fluoridation is in Alberta and in Ontario. Ontario is the big one.
Are you aware of any of the communities that have taken it out and put it back in?
No, I'm not. I know Calgary took it out. That was 1.2 million people. Thanks to my co-author, James Beck. They've not put it back in. Waterloo took it out. They haven't put it back in. Dryden took it out. They haven't put it back in. No, I'm not aware of any community that's put it back in. It's in the United States they have. In the United States, sometimes a council will make a quick decision. Why are we doing this? It's costing money. So they stop doing it. And before they know what's happened, a whole posse of dentists comes in and accuses them of ruining their children and so on. And they get intimidated. They get intimidated by the white coats, by the medical officers of health.
Was there no supporting data that was it just anecdotal? that there were, I'm assuming their argument would be that there was an increase in dental decay.
Yeah, that's right.
Was there any backup?
It is anecdotal, that's right. For example, there is a story out there that since Calgary stopped fluoridation, tooth decay in children has gone up. But if you trace it down, it's an anecdotal report from 2 dentists. And none of these things should be taken seriously until they published it in a peer-reviewed journal.
It is my understanding Alberta Health has done no studies at all where fluoride has been removed, and they've documented any.
Well, that's not surprising because you've hardly done any studies in Canada. No studies on the brain, no studies on the endocrine system, virtually no studies on the bone. You're flying blind. And also the thing which really is upsetting from an ethical point of view is that there are many people, and probably some sitting in this audience, who are super sensitive to fluoride. They are convinced that they're super sensitive to fluoride. They come down with symptoms. They find out from somebody it may be fluoride in the water, so they stop drinking the fluoridated water and their symptoms clear up. We have many, many reports. Many of the people that have sleepless nights and fight this are people that are super sensitive to fluoride because they know, they've experienced it firsthand. But guess what? Not one health agency in one fluoridated country has attempted to put this on a scientific level, to go to these people that claim to be super sensitive and expose them to double-blind trials to see if in fact they are, whether they can pass this test scientifically and rigorously. Not one. I don't call that very responsible, do you? I mean, it's their practice, and you've got people out there that are being hurt by this practice, or they think they're being hurt by this, and the government is not doing a darn thing to check out to see if they are indeed super sensitive to fluoride.
Why do you think that is? Why is there such resistance from the medical community to accept this as
you're asking
not
me,
a good thing?
We're trying to find a rational answer to irrational behavior. These public health agencies and the doctors and dentists, we're only taught one thing at dental and medical school, why they continue to do this even after the evidence that it works is very, very weak, when they themselves admit that it works topically, for which there are alternatives, and for which now there is serious evidence of harm, why they continue to do it. It's irrational. So what? Can you find a rational explanation? Well, there may be several, but it's all conjecture, for what it's worth. I believe this is it. The fluoridation really, in terms of public health, is not worth a hill of beans. It's a very modest, even if you accept their wonky studies, you're talking about less than 1 tooth surface saved. Okay. It's not worth all the money, all the angst, all the political pressure, etc., that's going into promoting this. So why? I think the formula is this. If they lose fluoridation, that's how they see it, if they lose fluoridation, they lose credibility. If they lose credibility, they lose the public's trust. If they lose the public's trust, it will threaten other public health practices. And when you look at those other public health practices, that's where you see the big money, the big interest. There are big economic interests that have an interest in keeping fluoridation going. One is the sugar industry. The sugar industry has always had fluoride as the magic bullet to distract from the real cause of tooth decay, which is too much sugar. That's the real cause of tooth decay. And they don't want people in science to study that and prove that. In 1949, 1 year before the US Public Health Service mysteriously endorsed fluoridation with no science on the table, the sugar lobby said, we need to find a way to reduce tooth decay without reducing sugar consumption. And then 1 year later, fluoridation comes in, and they put millions of dollars into professors of nutrition to promote sugar as a nutrient and to promote fluoridation. They did that for years and years and years. So the sugar lobby. Secondly, if fluoridation goes down, the toothpaste manufacturers are going to have a huge liability problem, especially if fluoridation goes down because of health effects. Then these deep pockets, this multi-billion-dollar industry that's selling fluoridated toothpaste is also going to be worried about getting a hit. There are a lot of industries that use fluoride in their processes. release fluoride pollution, like the phosphate fertilizer industry, like the aluminum industry, and other metal industries, the oil industry, and so on. And if it turns out that a few milligrams of fluoride a day are sufficient to cause problems, like mental problems, what is it going to say about the exposure of their own workers to fluoride, say, in the pot lines of the aluminum industry, which is much, not just a few milligrams, a lot of milligrams per day. So those guys probably are very frightened of liabilities, lawsuits, and so on. And that's where it began. If you read The Fluoride Deception by Chris Bryson, took him 10 years to write this book, he documented the collusion between the US Public Health Service and the Fluorine Lawyers Association. The Fluorine Lawyers Association were there to protect industry from lawsuits, from fluoride damage to farms, etc. And what was the US Public Health Service doing? Working with those guys. But it's a religious belief. It's very difficult to overcome a religious belief. They believe it works. They believe it so strongly they don't have to read the literature.